We're still in section 14.1. I'm going to call this 14.1 part 2. And the learning outcome is distinguish between the functions and locations of motor neurons, sensory neurons, and interneurons. And you just thought, I thought we already did that. But the learning outcome that we had said describe the functions of the nervous system, the motor function, the sensory function, and the integrative function. So we said sensory function was sensing the environment and bringing information into the central nervous system. The integrative function was where we thought about things and processed and planned and had memories formed and all that. And motor function was was the functions that caused movement or triggered glands and things like that. So there actually are specific kinds of neurons that do these things. So what we have is, I'm going to start with the sensory neuron. And remember we said these neurons look a little bit different, but they're all still neurons. So sensory neurons are going to carry sensory information. Remember we said dendrites have receptors and they can carry, they get stimulated somehow, whether it's temperature or touch or light or sound. We have some kind of sensory receptors, and the sensory neurons are going to carry impulses from the PNS, from the peripheral nervous system, to the CNS, to the central nervous system. The sensory neurons, write that down, it's important. Sensory neurons are going to carry electrical impulses from the PNS. So they're going to sense things. They're going to sense temperature or pressure or pain or light or whatever. Sensory neurons are going to carry information from the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, to the brain or the spinal cord, which is the central nervous system. And we're going to receive that sensory information, and it's going to end up in the central nervous system. So that sensory information is going to, the sensory neuron is going to carry electrical impulses to interneurons. And so interneurons integrate that sensory information. It takes it in, it analyzes it. I mean, when you're sitting here you're using your vision, you're looking at this picture and you're saying, oh, there's a neuron, it's yellow, it's got dendrites, there's a nucleus, all that. You're integrating all that, you're thinking about it. So the interneurons are processing information in the central nervous system. And once that information is processed, it doesn't just sit there. A lot of it, some of it actually gets stored away, but a lot of it causes us to react. So as you're processing this, you're thinking, I better write it down. So the interneuron is going to send an impulse to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron carries impulses from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system, and is going to cause something to happen. It's going to cause a muscle to contract. It's going to cause a gland to secrete a hormone, things like that. Okay, so motor neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we looked at how neurons have impulses that go in one direction. So this motor neuron is going to be oriented in a way that it's going to carry that impulse from the central nervous system to the peripheral. So just to summarize, sensory neurons carry sensory information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Interneurons function within the central nervous system, within the brain and spinal cord. And motor neurons carry information from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system, out the nerves, and cause some kind of reaction in a muscle or a gland. Okay. So, how do neurons connect with each other? It says, explain the role of synapses and neurotransmitters in the transmission of a nervous impulse. So a synapse is a place where neurons connect to each other, or an effector. An effector means a gland or a muscle, something that's going to do something. A synapse is a place where neurons connect to each other. So if we look at this, this diagram, so we've got this sensory neuron, it's got some dendrites, it's going to carry an impulse, and it's going to bring that information to the interneurons in the central nervous system. And notice that these neurons are actually touching each other. And the places where these neurons are touching are called synapses. This neuron is going to touch another neuron, and that is where we create synapses. Now, this is a very simple, simplified diagram, because if it looked like what it really looked like, you wouldn't be able to see these finer points, because there would be so much here. Because each neuron has hundreds to thousands of synapses. They have hundreds of thousands of connections. How do you, when you're thinking about something, how do you know that's yellow? Well, there's information stored in your brain, and there's neurons connected to that. You learned at one time that color's yellow. How do you know that's an arrow? Well, you have that in your memory. And so these neurons are connected to lots of other neurons where this memory is stored or where information is being processed. Did you ever hear the thing about, doing crossword puzzles makes you smarter, or doing Sudoku, or doing anything that challenges your brain? It actually creates more synapses. It creates more connections between neurons. I had a student in class the other day that said, this lecture is making my brain hurt. And I said, yay, because when your brain makes physical effort, when you have to physically think and process and try to remember, what you're doing is your neurons are actually forming branches, and they're growing and connecting to other neurons. You're creating more synapses. That painful thing that happens when you're trying to learn something is causing you to form synapses, connections between neurons. And that's where we get our memory. That's where we get our ability to figure things out, when more neurons are connected to others. Okay, think about, I don't know, like a road that leads to your house. There's one way to get to your house. Well, and you kind of use that pathway all the time. Well, actually, if there's other little side streets, you might find other ways to get to your house. So if something happens, like a tree is down, you have another way to get to your house, or another way to process information, process what's going on. And so neurons can have lots of different synapses, lots of different connections to get us to think of things in different ways. Explain the role of synapses and neurotransmitters in the transmission of nervous impulses. So here we have, so this is blown up. If we look at this, so what we're looking at is one of these little connections between the axon terminal, the end of an axon, and a cell body. So here we have, if you look at that, there's the end of an axon terminal, and it's touching us the next neuron in order. So this is it blown up. So here's your electrical impulse coming down, tick, 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 tick. And now you want to stimulate the next neuron. You want to stimulate this neuron is going to stimulate this one. There's this weird thing that happens. It's kind of has to do with physics, that this electrical current in this first neuron can't just jump into the next neuron. Think about, we know, like when you have an electrical plug, we know if you put your finger outside of the plug, you will not get shocked. The electricity isn't going to jump through the air and touch your finger. There actually needs to be something that allows this electrical current to transfer from one neuron to another. And what this is a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is one of 100 or so different chemicals that's made by a neuron, so the electrical impulse can jump over the space between two neurons, jump over the synapse, or what we call the synaptic cleft, a little space. There's a tiny little space between the neuron and the cell that it wants to stimulate, and you need a chemical, a neurotransmitter, to jump across that synapse. So we need neurotransmitters to transmit nervous impulses. We have the electrical impulse, and then we have a neurotransmitter, and that starts an electrical impulse in the next neuron. You've heard of some of these neurotransmitters. So like I said, there's about 100 different chemicals in humans that act as neurotransmitters. Some of them stimulate neurons, some of them slow down neurons. They can have different effects. And probably most people are familiar with adrenaline, which causes, it says produced in stressful or exciting situations. Somebody just walked in and gave you a big package and your heart starts to race. That was adrenaline. Or you get the test put in front of you and all of a sudden you feel really nervous and scared. You might be having a rush of adrenaline. And what that's doing is it's stimulating certain neurons in your nervous system. You might have heard of neurotransmitters called dopamine. That's sometimes called the pleasure neurotransmitter. There's all sorts of drugs, medications related to depression and mental health that regulates serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that can stimulate neurons to affect your mood. So there's lots of different, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that causes muscles to contract. So there's all sorts of different neurotransmitters, but you need a neurotransmitter to connect information from one neuron to another. I just thought this was kind of a cool picture showing you, here's a cell body. This green part's a cell body of a neuron. And look at all these axon terminals from other neurons that are touching that neuron cell body. We've got lots of synapses forming between two neurons. And so every time that this neuron is going to send an electrical impulse, it's got to make a little bit of a neurotransmitter to then stimulate this neuron. So that's some really basic information about just the nervous system and the cells that are involved. And I wanted to talk to you about two diseases that are related to that information. The first one is explain how the disease ALS affects the nervous system. ALS stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I always want to put an L in there. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. You might have heard of this disease called ALS. It's also called Lou Gehrig's disease. I think Lou Gehrig was diagnosed with ALS in 1939, I believe. And this is that, if you remember the water bucket challenge, when people were dumping it was like a social media thing, people dumping ice cold buckets of water on their heads. This was to raise money for this disease. And so ALS, like I said, it really got awareness in when Lou Gehrig, who was a very famous Yankee baseball player, there's Babe Ruth next to him. He got this disease, and it kind of caught on the name Lou Gehrig disease because everybody knew about it. But he got the disease, and 2 years later he died of it. But he was very famous. There's a really famous audio of something that he said during a Yankees game about how he's the luckiest man alive, even though he got this disease, because he's had such a wonderful career. But getting ALS is just a really horrible disease. What it does is it damages your motor neurons. ALS damages motor neurons. So think about what your motor neurons are doing. If we go back, that you can sense things, you can integrate them, you can think about them, but you can't respond to them. So in ALS, you gradually lose functions of your motor neurons. So you can imagine that people can lose functions of their big muscles, the muscles of their body. Here's Stephen Hawking. You might know Stephen Hawking as a very famous physicist who died a few years ago. He had ALS for decades, which is really uncommon. Most people that get ALS die within a few years, but Stephen Hawking got it when he was 22 or 20. He was in his 20s, and he died in his 70s. So he had it for decades, but he was well known for being wheelchair bound because he was losing function of motor neurons. But his happened very gradually. And you can imagine that eventually you would lose the ability to speak and the ability to breathe. And so eventually you will die of it. But Stephen Hawking actually had a lot of technology assistance that allowed him to speak using electronic media and communicate through a computer. So, but ALS, the main thing to remember about that is it damages motor neurons. So you'll lose the ability to move and breathe eventually and all that. It's a fatal disease. The other one that you've probably heard of is multiple sclerosis, and you might hear multiple sclerosis called MS. And what multiple sclerosis affects are the myelin sheaths of neurons. And so remember we said that the myelin sheath helps speed up nervous impulses. And sometimes, if you don't have myelin sheaths formed, the even really basic things, functions can be very difficult. A lot of people with MS end up wheelchair bound because their neurons don't respond quickly enough to allow them to move and coordinate, being able to stand and walk. Someone in my family has MS, and the first thing she got is she woke up one day and she couldn't see out of one of her eyes. There was damage to the myelin sheath and her optic nerves, the nerves connected to her eyes, or to one eye in particular. But multiple sclerosis, we don't know what causes it. In fact, we don't know what causes ALS. There's a small percentage of people with ALS that it's inherited, but the vast majority of them, we don't know why people get it. Same thing with MS. We don't typically know why people get it, but and you can get signs and symptoms of it, and then it can go away. So this person I know in my family that got it, she actually, her vision came back over the next couple months. And but some people will wake up one day and be unable to walk, and they might regain or they might not. And there's versions of MS that you can have episodes and recover. Your myelin sheaths reform, and there's other kinds of MS that you can just gradually deteriorate. So this is also a fatal disease, but it varies tremendously from person to person how long it's going to, or how dramatically it's going to affect somebody. And so the loss of function we see with multiple sclerosis is due to the decline in that, or deterioration of the myelin sheath. So you can't move, your neurons aren't coordinating very quickly. On that note, here we go. Check your progress. Describe the 3 types of neurons, list the main parts of a neuron, and summarize how a nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to the next. Really basically with neurotransmitters. I'm going to stop right there.